Hello and welcome to another Magic the Gathering draft video. It's Al here with you. This is how to draft MTG. Today I'm going to be going over my Brothers War format update and pick order. If you're having trouble in the format or you want a few extra tips on how to navigate the format a little bit better, this video is going to show you my general strategy for the format and how I approach the drafting process. Before we get into it, as always, please click like, comment, leave a comment, that is, and click subscribe if you enjoy what we're doing here. Helps the channel a lot. Let your friends know about it. Bring some new folks over here. It's always much appreciated. And thank you, as always, for the support. We're going to get straight into it. We're going to talk about the format rules. And what I mean by this is sort of some rules that you need to kind of abide by yourself in order to have success. All right, number one, be proactive, which essentially means do something on turn 2. Definitely do something by turn 3. Hopefully it's play a creature, but it could be doing something like playing an artifact that comes into play and draws a card, or you know, a mana fixing play or something like that. But you have to be proactive. You want to ideally be ahead of your opponent, and you want to be the person who is either the aggressor or the person who's getting to their powerful stuff first. Number 2, which kind of works in with this, is to build a low curve into your deck. You want 6 or more plays on turn 2 or turn 1. And the more the merrier. Number 3, we want to take colorless cards and fixing highly. And we're going to get into why that is in a little bit, but it kind of goes right into number 4, which is to play as many good cards as possible. This seems kind of obvious, but by taking colorless cards and fixing early in the draft, we could pick up all the high-powered cards we see in the draft, and we'll have a better shot at actually being able to put them in our deck, rather than picking up a couple of red cards, a couple of white cards right off the bat, and being locked into red-white and unable to play the super powerful green card we open in Pack 2, for example. And number 5 also kind of relates to 3 and 4. Don't force archetypes. We're going to talk a little bit about the archetypes. The aggro archetypes especially don't do well unless you get all the pieces, and they do need to kind of be open. So I would not recommend forcing aggro, even though that was sort of the prevailing wisdom early on in the format. I think now that people are aware that the format is kind of fast, kind of aggressive, you want to be proactive, you want to have a low curve, the aggro decks are not as available, so I would not recommend forcing anything in the draft. This is definitely a quote-unquote draft the hard way set, if you're familiar with that concept from the great Ben Stark. This is definitely that kind of set. Okay, let's get right into it. The main archetypes that you're likely to end up in here. The first is multicolor green, which tends to be, in my experience, base green black, if anything, or it's green splashing a few other colors like red, blue, and black, for example, or you know, a couple white cards, a couple of black cards, whatever. The second is red aggro, which is was the top strategy in the format. I'm not sure that's the case anymore, but red white, red blue spells, red black sacrifice, and red green aggro. And the third is white aggro, white red, which is the same as red white, white blue soldiers, and white black artifacts. White green artifacts. White black, not as much really a supported deck, but you could definitely just play a bunch of good white creatures and good black removal spells and do just fine. Okay, getting into the pick order here. General overview of the pick order for this format. I've done it by tiers this time. These are my own tiers. They're not supposed to compare to anybody else's tiers, so hopefully this kind of makes sense. Tier 0, I have bombs. It's fairly self-explanatory, just the very best cards in the set. Tier 1 is a big tier. There's premium colorless cards, there's fixing, there's signpost uncommons, and there's premium removal. Tier 2 is the good kind of flexible cards that fit into a lot of different decks, and then what I'm calling archetype cards, which are cards that you want for specific decks in the format. And then tier 3 is going to be the filler. Once we sort of know what deck we're in, we start to pick up cards that fill out different roles that we need filled in that deck. Okay, so tier 0, bombs. Best cards in the set: Titania's Command, Siege Veteran, Gix's Command, Wormcoil Engine. This is fairly self-explanatory. You can go on 17lands.com and look at the best cards in the set. It's pretty easy to see. Sort by game in hand win rate and pick these cards highly. They're amazing. There's a lot of really good rares in this set, which actually plays into my draft strategy in particular. Next is Tier 1. Cards we're looking for here, premium colorless cards. Okay, these would include Energy, Refractor, Chromatic Star, Evolving Wilds, Elsewhere Flask. These are all colorless fixing cards, which is great. They'll go into any deck, and they're going to help us to play the really good rares that we might happen to open or get past later in the draft. So these are going to keep us open in the draft, and these are great early picks because they fit into any deck. In addition, we've got Sentinel Stalwart. This might be a little bit of a hot take, but I think it's quite good. It, generally speaking, is always able to tap to add mana of any color, which is super powerful because there's so many busted cards in the set that we want to put in our deck. And then Scrapwork Cohort and Scrapwork Mutt are not fixing cards, but they're colorless cards that also fit into every deck. And because we're taking these other mana fixing cards so highly, it's easy to activate their Unearth abilities even if they're not part of a deck that is their color. So if we're playing Scrapwork Cohort in a black-red deck, if we're prioritizing Energy, Refractor, and Chromatic Star, we're not going to have a problem unearthing it. Likewise, Scrapwork Mud, I've played in a lot of multicolored green decks where I'm green-black, maybe splashing blue, but this is a great turn 2 play, helps us to filter a little bit, maybe trades in combat, and then later on in the game, not too hard to unearth it. And then finally, there's Foundry and Spectre, which just makes so many cards in our deck cheaper since we're prioritizing all these artifacts that I think it's a very high pick. Then we're looking at the best Signpost uncommons, the best of the Signpost uncommons. Phalagi Vanguard is quite excellent for red-white aggro, of course. Skyfisher Spider, one of the most powerful cards in the set. Super good multicolored green, green-black, any kind of mid-range sort of pile strategy. This is your go-to card, and you never want to pass this one. Third Path Iconoclast obviously puts us into red-blue. Yoshin Dissonant is the green-white Signpost uncommon, super excellent there. And Yoshin Tactician sets us up to play blue-white soldiers. So these 5 in particular are important because if we see them pick 3, pick 4, pick 5 in a pack, we can take them and they really start to give our draft a direction because they're very powerful and they're an indication that that color combination is not being drafted by the players to our right. So we can start to move into that color combination. It'll really give good direction to our draft. Secondarily, if we're drafting fixing really highly, we can actually play multiple of these in the same deck. We could have a deck that's got Skyfisher Spider and Third Path Iconoclast in it, which is kind of an interesting combination because the Iconoclast makes soldiers to fuel the Spider, or the Iconoclast could make soldiers to fuel the Dissonant. And it is possible to play multiple of these in the same deck. And you should definitely look to do that if you've got enough fixing. And then, of course, we got our premium removal here. Excavation, Explosion, Obliterating Bolt in red. Overwhelming Remorse, Go for the Throat in black. And Static Net and Prison Sentence in white. Pretty self-explanatory. So any of the cards I've just mentioned, they all fall into this Tier 1 category for me. You probably won't have to pick between them all that often. But if you do, I would say go for the colorless fixing first, followed probably by those Signpost uncommons, and then followed by these removal spells. But it's very close, and there's certainly situations where you're going to take one over the other. So I would invite you to use your own discretion in that respect. Next, we're going into the Tier 2 cards. So again, this is a big tier. Here's a group of cards that are just flexible. They're going to fit into most decks, so they're great to take early. I've certainly first picked these in the past out of weaker packs. Ashnod's Harvester, Burnished Heart as a little fixing engine that's a little bit slower. Combat Career is a nice one. Comes down on turn 1, maybe trades off, or maybe provides a little card advantage. Combat Thresher as just a very powerful colorless card that's really good in white decks. And then we've got a few other colorless options here. Ichor Wellspring, Mishra's Bauble, Soul Guide Lantern, all good in decks that care about artifacts, but they don't fix mana, so they're not as high a priority. And then Reconstructed Thopter, again, just kind of a solid creature. It attacks and blocks, comes back from the dead, it triggers your artifact stuff, and it's colorless. So then we're talking also about the archetype cards that I mentioned before. So if we find ourselves wanting to move into multicolor green, it might be because we're seeing some of these cards pop up. Obstinate Baloth, Bushwhack, Sarenth Steelseeker, and Blanchwood Prowler, all premium for the green decks. Actually, 3 out of the 4 of these help us hit land drops and fix our lands. And then Baloth is just big old beefy stats and life gain to help us survive against the aggro decks. We've got Argothian Opportunist as a ramp piece and a good card on curve. Argothian Sprite is a great 2-drop that we can pump up later in the game. Boulder Branch Golem as a big endgame threat that, again, can sort of put us out of range of the aggro decks. This can kind of be your endgame plan if you don't end up with like a really good rare. Boulder Branch Golem, 2 or 3 of these in your deck can do a lot of work. And then Gaia's Gift is just so good on offense and defense. Your creature will never lose the combat, which is really, really important. It saves it from removal. Just be careful, as always, casting combat tricks when your opponent's got mana up, because they could respond with a removal spell and blow you out. And then I've got Emergency Weld by itself here. This is a really important one I find for this deck, especially with the Skyfisher Spider. It's a great way to reuse it and destroy extra permanents, but it's also just really important for buying back stuff like Boulder Branch Golems. And when you're milling yourself a bunch with Blanchwood Prowler and some other cards that fit into this deck, it's just really, really important to have at least one of these. So I just wanted to single that out. And then, of course, we're looking for good cards to splash. We're going to have a lot of fixing. That's the whole point of this deck. Battery Bearer does really well here. You tend to be able to cast more expensive spells, and you want to put them in your deck. So Battery Bearer has really impressed me in this archetype in particular. Hero of the Dunes can be good if we have a lower curve and a bunch of stuff that it can bring back. And we are milling ourselves, so that works in synergy as well. And then Arbalest Engineer is just a really good rate. The 1 damage is actually a really, really good mode on this one. But of course, if you want the Power Stone or the +1/+1 counter, those are always going to be excellent as well. And then Take Flight's a card that's really worked out for me in this archetype. Really powerful. If you can play it on a turn when your opponent's tapped out, you get your card back for sure, get in for some damage. And if they can't answer it, you just win. And if they can't answer it, then you probably, at the very least, you 1-for-1 them and took a premium removal spell from them. If not, you got in for a few turns and really pulled ahead. So a really good card, and this is a great home for it. And now we're going to take a step down from Tier 2 for a brief moment. We're going to come back to it. But these would be the filler cards that fit into this archetype. And so we're talking about interaction spells like Disfigure, Power Stone Fracture, Epic Confrontation, Disenchant. If you don't get the good removal, then play the bad removal. We want big stuff to cast with all our mana and fixing and all that stuff. Rust Goliath, Suchi, Cave Guard, Iron Croc Crusher, and Mask of the Jade Crafter are great endgame pieces for this deck. And one card in particular that's great to splash here, Mightstone's Animation. If we have a lot of those fixing artifacts that we're taking early in the draft, this is a nice 1 of, maybe 2 of. And then finally we have Curve Filler. We've got Haywire Might, Gnawing Vermin as turn 1 plays that can slow down the aggro decks. Thraxodemon as a 2-mana 2/2 can trade off early for you or give you a little bit of an advantage in the late game. And then Ravenous Gigamole. Sometimes the 4-drop slot gets pretty clogged up in this deck if you've got a couple of Obstinate Baloths. The Boulder Branch Golems can act as 4-drops. But if you do need 4-drops, Gigamole is one of the better ones. We want to be playing a lot of creatures, and it can generate some advantage for us and put stuff in our graveyard for other purposes as well. Okay, jumping back up to Tier 2, these are some of the cards that will draw us into the red aggro side of things. So these are great cards to pick up early if we're not seeing the fixing, if we're not seeing the premium removal, Signpost uncommons. If we're seeing these really good red cards, we're going to take those and maybe lean towards red aggro. Horned Stoneseeker, Giant Cindermaw, pretty self-explanatory. Mishra's Research Desk, a little bit underrated still, I think, but this card is very, very good, especially in a low-curve aggro deck where by the time you're starting to activate this, you don't really want the lands anymore. It's almost like a draw 4, and it also triggers artifact stuff like Goblin Blast Runner, which we're going to talk about in a second. So Mishra's Research Desk, really, really good. Blast Runner, an important part of the red aggro decks. You do want multiple of these, and this is why I'm saying that these aggro decks are a little bit harder to get into now because people know they're good and you kind of need all the pieces. You want to be the one person at the table is drafting Blast Runner, and you want to get 3 or 4, and you want to get the good artifacts that synergize with it. Otherwise, it doesn't really get there, so just be aware of that. But if you're seeing them late, if you see one, pick 2, and then you get past one, pick 6 or 7, you can maybe count on wheeling that one that you saw previously pick 2, and kind of go from there. But sometimes it feels like it really needs to be a perfect storm to make that Blast Runner deck happen, whereas in week 1, it was much more available. We've also got Pendragon Strongbow, which is just one of the best red commons. Synergizes with Blast Runner, synergizes with any of those sort of cantrip fixing artifacts that we talked about earlier. Just a really, really good card in general. And then Bitter Reunion. I'm putting in this category. It's a little bit lower of a priority, but it's very good with Blast Runner, and it's just a great effect in general in this format when you've got unearth cards that you can pitch to it, and you kind of want to put stuff in your graveyard. And of course, the sacrifice ability on it will pump up your Blast Runner. So these are the cards that we're sort of looking at to get us into red aggro, and then what would make us want to pair red with white. All these really good white cards: Recruitment Officer, Yoshin Frontliner, pretty self-explanatory. And this trio of commons, which is just a really, really powerful package: Airlift Chaplain, Ambush Paratrooper, Aeronaut Cavalry. If we're going to pair red with blue, we're looking for Thopter Mechanic, Zephyr Sentinel, Levitating Statue, Involuntary Cooldown, which just kills our opponent when we cast it. Mightstone's Animation. Again, if we've got those cheap artifacts that I was talking about earlier, for prioritizing those, we'll have lots of targets for this. Take Flight, perfect spot for this. When we've got our third path Iconoclast, we want to be casting non-creature spells, and we're base blue, or half blue or whatever. Take Flight's going to be really good here. And then Stern Lesson is a spell to trigger the Iconoclast, and contributes a power stone. Maybe we pitch an unearth card to it. There's some synergy going on there for sure. So that's what would make us want to get into red blue, red green. Some of the good green cards we talked about already: Obstinate Baloth, Audacity, which is a bit more of an aggro driven card. This fits well here. Ironcroc Crusher, just a big beefer, but it can also come down on turn 4 and be effective. Argothian Opportunist helps us a little bit with ramp, good 3-drop, and Gaia's Gift, of course, just the most powerful combat trick in the set. So I should mention that these red pairings are really going to be informed by those Signpost uncommons we talked about earlier. So we're going to be much more inclined to draft red-white if we have a Phalagi Vanguard, red-blue if we have a third path Iconoclast, or red-green if we have the Arbalest Engineers. For red-black Sacrifice, we're looking for the Signpost uncommon Junkyard Genius, which is super powerful in this archetype, and the card Sibling Rivalry. If we start to see a few of these, can be a good indication that we should move into red-black, as it's very powerful to steal our opponent's stuff and then sacrifice it for value. Going to move down from tier 2 to the filler tier here. Interaction cards. Depending on what color you're in as your secondary color, you'll want to pick these up if you don't have good interaction already. Unleash Shell, Disenchant, Power Stone, Fracture, Disfigure, and Machine Over Matter. Curve filler, again, depending on your colors: Monastery Swift Spear, Wing Commando, Rock Hunter, Killzone Acrobat, Mishra's Juggernaut, Phalanx Vanguard, and Argothian Sprite all fit well in red-based aggro decks. And one card on its own here in terms of evasion: if you're lacking creatures with flying, Aeronaut's Wings is a great way to give your creatures flying and give yourself a little bit of inevitability in the late game. And then finally, we've got combat tricks. Again, depending on your colors, Whirling Strike, Military Discipline, Giant Growth, Moment of Defiance, all excellent in their respective decks. Okay, back to Tier 2. We're going back up. Hopefully this isn't too confusing. The white-based aggro decks. We're going to talk about, again, this core group of 5 really excellent white cards: Recruitment Officer, Yoshin Frontliner, Airlift Chaplain, Ambush Paratrooper, Aeronaut Cavalry. All pretty self-explanatory here. If we're prioritizing the good creatures with Unearth, the Scrapwork Cohort, and the Scrapwork Mutt, Airlift Chaplain is quite good because it starts to put those in your graveyard for value, and you can either pump it up by choice or put a planes in your hand or what have you. So again, that's just where those early picks can help us out later once we start to settle into an archetype. So yeah, I think these are pretty self-explanatory. White-red we already went over. White-blue is the Soldiers deck, so we're going to want to support our white cards with Zephyr Sentinel, Thopter Mechanic, Air Marshal. White-green is the Artifact theme, so if we have that Yoshin Dissident, that gives us a 1/1 counter every time we play an artifact. We're going to want to move into green if we've got some white cards already. Mask of the Jadecrafter triggers that Signpost uncommon. Yoshin Dissident triggers it twice. Twice, and then 2 more times when we unearth it and make another golem, so that's quite powerful. And we can also end up with some Power Stones to really pump it up. Obstinate Bailos, just a great card. Gaia's Gift, just a great card. Opportunist gives us an artifact trigger and a little bit of ramp. Blanchwood Prowler helps us hit our land drops. And as I said before, white-black, not really heavily supported. I wouldn't recommend going there. And then in terms of filler, you could pretty much just copy and paste what we talked about for the red-based aggro decks. So hopefully this gives you a good guideline of how to approach a draft in this format. If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below. But yeah, the gist of it is take those colorless cards early, take mana fixing early, let the draft tell you where to go. And this might sound silly and kind of oversimplified, but this format I find really rewards you for just looking at the cards you have in your pool and looking at the pack and saying what works well with what I have here or what allows me to stay open and stay flexible, rather than in some formats you're really trying to angle your way into one of the best decks, quote unquote. I don't think that's the case in this format. I think you want to stay open, stay flexible, let the cards come to you, and play as many powerful busted cards as you can. That's going to do it for this one. Again, let me know in the comments if you have any questions, if you agree, if you disagree, what's been working for you. Thank you so much for watching. As always, click like, click subscribe if you want to reach out to me directly, howtodraftmtg@gmail.com. We'll talk to you on the next one. Bye for now.